In this little series on community in America, we've been looking at some of the visionaries, the Ben Franklins, the Booker T. Washingtons, Jane Addams, and there, of course, there are so many others. And also, we have been looking at some of the foundations or the pillars on which a truly healthy community must always stand. And for that, we've turned to Roger Williams, John Adams in his defense of the British soldiers. We've looked at Jacob Riis, and today we go to yet a fourth. And for that, we're going to go to 1955, December 5th, to a sharecropper's farm near Troy, Alabama, not too far away from Montgomery. And there in the cabin of the sharecropper, John Lewis, 15 years old, is gathering around a kitchen table with 9 siblings, and they're tuning into a radio because they've heard that that evening there's going to be a very important presentation coming from a church there in Montgomery. It is because the 4 days earlier, Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus, had been protesting the segregation laws there in Montgomery. And then on this day, on the 5th of December, on the very day when she was to be tried, there would be a great meeting in the evening deciding what to do. Already the day before, they had called for a boycott, and all day long on the 5th of December, almost all black customers, all 3/4 of the bus riders in Montgomery refused to ride the buses. And that evening, there would be this great meeting in the church. Well, in the afternoon, there in Montgomery, business leaders and ministers got together to talk about what to do. And after they weighed the various possibilities, E.D. Nixon, the head of the NAACP, stood up and spoke and said, "What I'm not hearing here is the courage that we need to stand up for what is right and make sacrifices." And well, finally, a young minister, 26 years old, stood up and said, I don't think you can say we don't have courage. We're here simply trying to find what the right thing to do is." And E.D. Nixon looked at him and said, "Great, you will speak tonight at the meeting." And so he agreed to do so. That, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr., who woke up that morning early, worked on his PhD thesis, and then went over to the church and thought about what he would do on, say, on Sunday morning. That evening, he realized he was now going to be giving this presentation. He got home to his wife, who was pregnant with their first child, and had some 20 minutes to prepare. When he goes over to this church, there are thousands and thousands of people on the streets. They can't get in. They're putting up loudspeakers so they can hear. And he finally goes into the church, which is just completely packed to the rafters. The time comes when he has to speak. He starts by speaking of the events and Rosa Parks and what a fine person she is, and how well the boycott had gone on that day, and what the laws were and how they were wrong and how they needed to be changed. And he spoke, and for a time, people listened very patiently, but then he paused and he looked out over them, and he just says, "And my friends," he says, there comes a time when people become tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time," he says, "when people get tired of being plunged across an abyss of humiliation, where they face day to day the bleakness of a nagging despair," he says. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of a July day and being left standing in the chill of an alpine November. He says, there comes a time, about by this time, people are waking up and saying, "Yes, Martin, tell us more." You could hear, even coming through that radio, John Lewis and the others could tell that there was a tone of excitement that was building and building. And finally, Dr. King says, "And we are not wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie," he says, and love has no meaning. He says, "We are here determined in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Well, I'm sure those cheers came over the radio very well for John Lewis. He took that in. As you know, that boycott went on for over a year. A tremendous sacrifice of people until finally the right to ride on buses, black and white together, was established. Well, John Lewis, from the time he was little, he thought he wanted to be a speaker. He said, when I was 5 years old, I would go out to the chickens and give little speeches. Well, now he was thinking college. Well, he was fortunate enough to have gone to a Rosenwald school. Had quite a fine education there and was convinced that he could become the first member of the family to do this crazy thing and actually heading off to college. So he goes over to local state university there in Troy, and they turn him down. They say, no, they're not ready to have a black student. Goes down to Montgomery, meets Rosa Parks. He meets Dr. King and speaks with him about what he thinks he should do. And finally, Dr. King says, well, I think you should go up to Nashville. There are a number of schools up there, fine black schools. So he does. Well, there's Fisk University. Now he doesn't think he's going to be able to get into Fisk. It's very, very well known. But he can get into the American Baptist Seminary. So they say, we're welcome to have you, but you, of course, you have no money. Well, he manages to convince them, much like Booker T. Washington, to hire him on as a janitor to pay his way through. And there he is. Well, in the course of those first months, he starts meeting others who come down. Diane Nash from Chicago, beautiful young woman, 21 years old, and she comes to study at Fisk University, as does Paul LePrade, who was white, and he's coming from Indiana. Very few white students would go to black colleges, but he did. Met James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, and they began to talk. Now, Nashville was a town that was known for its general harmony, they felt, between black and white, and yet it was segregated. And so Diane Nash had never known segregation. Of course, John Lewis knew it very, very well. Paul LePrade never would experience what it meant to this kind of degradation. And they spoke about what it meant to go to a movie theater and pay your nickel and then have to go around in the back past the garbage and up the stairs and sit on rickety chairs and the water fountains and the cafes and the bus stations and the continual reminders. He says it's not just an inconvenience they felt. It is a loss of dignity, and it is that which we must stand up for on behalf of the people of Nashville. Well, they say, what can we do? Where do we start first? Well, it turns out that a man named James Lawson has appeared in Nashville in that year. He had spent a number of months, if not a year, in India studying with the Gandhians. He'd come back, gone up to Ohio to go to school. There he had met Dr. King, who said, no, we need you in the South. So he went instead to Vanderbilt University to study in the divinity school there in Nashville. They came over to him and said, can you tell us about what we can do and how we can work and in line with Gandhi, in line with what Dr. King is saying. So they start meeting together. And they start imagining, well, what really, where could we make our first step? And they talked about it for a while, and someone finally said, you know where it is? It's those department stores who are so happy to take in money from anyone, white or black. But then when these black customers come out carrying these bags and they feel my feet are tired, I want to sit down, have a cup of coffee, have a piece of pie, they see the sign there. This cafe is whites only. And they're forced to go by. That's where we should go. We should start there. And how could we do that? Well, James Lawson says, the first thing you must realize is that you have to be ready to experience suffering, blows, arrest, jail, all that goes with it. But he says, suffering is necessary. It puts us in touch with our consciences. It allows us to develop the grateful heart that we need, the open heart, so that we can meet the people who come towards us and may curse at us and spit at us and even rain blows upon us. And we can still recognize that within them there is a divine spark, and we must eternally be looking to allow that to come out. Even if they're coming at us with raised hands, we have to realize that That divine spark can be covered over by pain and by ugliness, by layers of ugliness. We have to be able to look deep into that person and to see them as they can't even see themselves. We have to imagine that a person coming towards us who might even be beating on us, imagine them as a baby, as an open-faced child who comes into this world. How did they get to this place? What fed? What fed his anger? What fed his fury? How do we meet it with compassion and forgiveness? Because if we do anything else, if we simply harden the hearts of the attackers, we just get set further back because hatred begets hatred and anger begets anger. How do we break that cycle? How do we do what Dr. King says? We have to love the unlovable. We have to literally love the hell out of the other person. It's what I learned with the Gandhians. Satyagraha, this soul force. The blessed are the meek. And that will lead us finally to helping build what Dr. King is calling the beloved community. The community in which people's hearts grow strong in the presence of others, regardless of what conflict comes, they can reach deep down into the sources of compassion and deep interest in the other person, however different they may be. Well, so with all of that, they said, yes, I think we can do it. And they were very excited to undertake this. Let's go and sit down in those lunch counters. Well, by this time, more people had joined, and there were about 100 of them now who were undergoing this training and learning this ability to see into the other person. Um, James Lawson said at one point, he says, you can't just turn this on and off like a switch when you go to a lunch counter or go to a demonstration. You can't have this love in your hearts for the other person and then react negatively when you go to a grocery store and meet a curt cashier or a taxi driver who says the wrong thing. This has to be something that manifests in our lives fully. Well, with that, they now agreed to go off. And on February 13th, 1960, 100 of them headed off to 4 different lunch counters. They dressed very well, coat and tie for the men and white dresses for the women. They were told nobody's going to come to your support, certainly not the police and the people of Nashville. Well, only college students can do this because other people, they risk their well-being, they risk their families, they risk their homes. So you are the ones as college students that need to find the courage to do this. And so these 100 college students go off and they walk in and sit down. Now, Diane Nash said one of the things we were told is we have to keep a straight face no matter what. We have to act dignified. We cannot laugh. And it was hard because this waitress came out, and as soon as she saw us, she dropped a whole plate full of trays. She came out again and dropped another plate full of trays, and we're all sitting there trying not to laugh. And we sat there, and then finally the word came, the lunch counter was closing. We sat there, they turned off the lights, and we just sat. We didn't study. We just sat and looked out. Um, and then, of course, it became dark, and they packed up and they went home. Well, Wednesday they came back again next time, and the following Saturday they came back and did it one more time. This time there were 200 of them, and by the third Saturday, this is the 27th of February, there was another 100 wanting to come, and they realized, well, they couldn't all have the training, and we wanted to make sure that everybody came with the feeling with the right attitude. So John Lewis printed out things that they needed to do, and so they could at least give each one a piece of paper. Look at this and learn this, and on it had the do's and the don'ts. Do not strike back, of course. Do not leave your seat. Do always be courteous. Always be polite. Always keep that love in your hearts. Always listen to directions, whether from one of us or from the police or whoever it might be. And so they went in and they sat down. Well, as they had come in, they had noticed that there were many other people coming. The word had come out that a lot of young toughs were coming into town. This is going to be a very difficult day. Police were standing outside, and these toughs were standing in front, and some of them were dancing in front of them, in front of John Lewis, and saying, "Do you want to fight? You want your chicken? You want?" And they just quietly walked in and sat down. Now, as they sat, there was a mirror in front of them, and so that they could see what was coming towards them. And it wasn't just a few people coming in and saying some bad things and asking them questions and that. They could see these were some tough people walking in with sticks, if not even baseball bats. And they sat there. All of a sudden, one of them felt ketchup coming down over his head, over the glasses, and onto them. Another one, they dumped some mustard on them. Then one of them felt sudden burn of a cigarette being put in the back of the neck. Um, Paul LePrade, with TV cameras were rolling by this time, was taken and thrown down on the ground and was beaten. John Lewis was beaten and was struck a number of times. And this went on until finally the police intervened and they arrested. They arrested who? Well, of course, they arrested the students, and off they went to jail. Well, the first ones were taken off, and then another 25 came and they sat down, and then they were taken off. Another 25 came down. Finally, they were just all arrested, and they were all taken off to the jail. And that jail that night, they said, was just rocking because the girls were on one side and they were singing to the top of their lungs, and the boys would try to outdo them on the other side, and they just went on all night with this singing going on. But then they had to be to face the judge, and Diane Nash was the first one. When she did, he said, "Okay, the fine will be $10 or 33 days in the workhouse." And she says, "I'm not paying that money. I'll take that." And she was let off, and a number of the others, it was the same thing. Well, the lunch counters continued for a while. They finally some conversations began to happen. And so they paused for a while. The department stores trying to work out what could be done, but it was clear that they weren't going to budge. And so once they were out of jail again, they were ready to start the lunch counters one more time. Well, by this time, Easter was coming up, and Easter was big for the department stores. Everybody there had to get your new bonnet and your new clothing and new shoes and so on for Easter. So if they boycotted these department stores, it would be quite a difficult thing for them. So that caused the department stores to sit down and start talking ever more with the leaders of the movement. And then came a day late in April, I believe it was the 29th day of April, and a bomb went off outside the house of Mr. Luby, who was their attorney. He and his family narrowly escaped. All the windows were blown out. And that was serious. That word went through the Black community, and there was tremendous feeling. Something has to be done. And so right away, the call went out. They said, the next day, we're going to march on City Hall. We're going to march quietly in City Hall. There's going to be no violence now. And they came out and led by John Lewis, led by Diane Nash, Paul LePrade, who still shows his signs of a terrible beating that he had endured, and others walking, leading hundreds of people, then thousands, finally 4 or 5, perhaps 6,000 people marching, coming together from different directions, and then marching the long road down towards the city hall. The streets lined with white people who were looking out. And they said later, we realized this is serious. There was no singing. There was just the sound of footsteps marching towards City Hall. Well, when they all gathered there, the mayor came out, Mayor Ben West. He was willing to speak, and Diane Nash came up to him and spoke for a little while. And finally, she just said, "But can you just tell me as a man, do you think it is right that just because of the color of one's skin, that one is denied service?" And he said, "Well, we have laws and we're talking about laws. We're negotiating. We're working. No, no, but she says, I just want to know as a man, how would you, yes or no, do you think that's right? That someone's denied service just because of the color of the skin?" And he finally says, "No, no, I have to say, I do not." Well, they cheer, the people who were there. And then the word goes out and the others start cheering. Well, it wasn't as if he had totally given in, but there was a turning now. They could feel the turning. And within a couple of weeks, the negotiations came, and many of these laws began finally to fade away in Nashville there in 1960. And I believe that that points, as I say, to another of these pillars or foundations on which a healthy society of a healthy life of community can be based. And we can go back to that term of Dr. King. How do we build the beloved community? Amid the natural disagreements that are going to rise among people, how do we get beyond them to look and to recognize what lives more deeply in another person, perhaps even more than they can see it themselves? And out of this, how a feeling can emerge that together, whether we are in our local neighborhood or in our town or in the state or even nationally, that this sense of community rooted in a sense of looking for what is deepest in the other person can emerge and stand there strong as a basis for everything that we do together. Now, after Nashville, John Lewis, the following year, would go on to organize the Freedom Riders and would ride those buses down into the Deep South and to suffer the consequences of that. And Diane Nash helped organize those who then joined down in Birmingham when it seemed as if the Freedom Riders were going to have to stop and instead went off to Montgomery and then all the way over to New Orleans to continue that. James Bevel, a few years later, would be down in Birmingham, and when it seemed as if those marches in Birmingham were going to simply fail, he turned to Dr. King and said, well, let me get the young people involved. And so he did, and he was deeply involved in making that the final success there on what came to be called the Birmingham Children's Crusade. That's another story, making that possible. John Lewis would then go on to serve in Congress for 17 years until his death on the 17th of July in 2020. And of course was deeply involved in the civil rights movement throughout his life.